Hello everybody, welcome to my presentation. Today I'll be aiming to analyse and review the character of Mr Toad from the well-known and popular novel The Wind in the Willows, written by Kenneth Grahame, as well as analysing Toad's erratic and more psychological behaviour through the use of the novel Counselling for Toads, which aims to take a more psychological approach to examining Toad's actions, as well as an insight as to the causes of why Toad often behaves so erratically and dangerous. I will also be taking a look at the movie The Wind in the Willows, so I'm able to gain all possible knowledge of the character. Mr Toad is known as a bubbly, comedic character who takes pride in making others laugh and enjoys spending time with his friends. Despite this, Toad has a tendency to act reckless and unpredictable, putting himself often at risk, which has slowly declined his mental state. In the novel Counselling for Toads, we as readers are able to identify a more vulnerable and less erratic side to him, as he goes into detail about his childhood trauma, bereavement issues and self-esteem issues to a counsellor recommended to him by his friends. I'll aim to analyse some of this behaviour through more of a psychological lens, using the social, psychological and biological model. Let's talk a little bit about what appears to be Toad's presenting problems. The presenting problem which can be identified for Toad relates to what appears to be a great sense of instability in his emotions. In Counselling for Toads, Toad describes how his emotions go from one extreme to another. He tells his counsellor that his spirits have started to fall and that he has begun to lose interest in things he usually finds enjoyment in. Toad usually takes great pride and joy in caring for his garden. We can identify he's struggling and out of his usual habits from the description of Toad Hall by his friend Ratty after he came to visit. He described Toad's house and garden as being completely run down, when usually Toad's home would be described by people as an impressive gentleman's residence. So it is alarming to me that he appears to have lost such interest and motivation. The presenting problem also appears to lie with Toad's self-esteem issues, relating to his need to impress others so desperately, to an extent where it becomes hazardous. In the movie The Wind in the Willows, Toad puts himself in a dangerous situation. He steps in front of a fast-moving cart towards him, while shouting faster. Not only does this present a lack of safety awareness from Toad, but it also implies he's presenting many dangerous risk factors to himself and others through this impulsive behaviour. In my opinion, another presenting problem relates to Toad's friendship dynamics. In the story The Wind in the Willows, we can identify a really quite strange friendship dynamic between Toad and his friend Badger. Badger appears to take on more of a parental, controlling role, as opposed to being more of a friendly figure. For example, Badger discusses with the mole how he once told Toad's father he would take Toad in hand and teach him how to be a responsible Toad like him. Badger also speaks on the behalf of Toad on many occasions. One example is to his guards at his home in Toad Hall, as he says, "Toad changes his mind." I believe Toad had quickly planned an impulsive trip on his motorcar, which is why his other friends Mole and Ratty carry him away against his will without explanation. Toad is clearly struggling with his obsession with motorcars in an unhealthy way, but it appears to me through the book and the movie that Toad's friends all have great intentions towards Toad and want the best for him. Without a certain level of respect and explanation, Toad may quickly feel belittled by his friends and less worthy. Badger also often speaks about how Toad's bereaved father would be ashamed of him, which I can identify makes Toad feel a sense of guilt, as he speaks about it to his counsellor very frequently. Toad also speaks to his counsellor about his unloving relationship he once had with his father as a child, which makes Badger's remarks all the more personal and distressing for Toad. This comes into the social model, relating to the dynamics and friendships Toad has with his peers, as well as the social factors in regards to the family he has, or lack of. In the book Counselling for Toads, Toad discusses with his therapist his upbringing and the lack of affection and validation he gained as a child. His father was cold towards him and never showed him much love. Toad talks about his mother as being a lovely woman, yet she restricted her level of affection towards Toad due to the lack of approval from her husband. His parents are both passed. We may be dealing with large amounts of trauma regarding to Toad's childhood, amplified by their death as well. With regards to diagnostics, knowing what we already know about Toad's current situation, we may be dealing with depression and potentially ADHD. We know through the book Counselling for Toads that currently Toad is in a depressive, antisocial state with little to no motivation. We also know Toad himself is genuinely an erratic and hyperactive character which has led me to believe that potentially bipolar disorder is a diagnostic to consider, as well as perhaps borderline personality disorder as well. On the NHS website, clinical depression is described as continuous low moods or sadness. However, I believe a continuous low mood of sadness is not what Toad is dealing with, but more of an unstable rollercoaster of emotions, from overwhelmingly erratic to extreme outbursts of hopelessness and sadness, which is what Toad appears to be dealing with currently. I think Toad is dealing with many symptoms of mania as well. As described through the NHS website, mania can be described as feeling very high and overactive. We know from an insight into Toad's general character that he is very prone to an erratic outburst, leading him to partaking in risky actions such as jumping out into a moving car. If it wasn't for knowing so much about Toad's character, one might view his impulsive actions as being an act of attempting suicide or to harm himself, as we know the risk factors involved in jumping in front of a car would have. But when analysing Toad's general behaviour, I believe his actions come from a more impulsive and manic state. With regards to mania, another reason why I believe bipolar disorder is an important diagnostic to consider is due to one of the symptoms of mania being having ambitious plans and ideas, as stated by the NHS website. This is important to note with regards to Toad, as he is known to feel the sudden urge to want to travel the world in various large vehicles he's impulsively bought. Typically, a person feeling the desire to want to travel and explore would not be something to perceive as abnormal, but in terms of Toad and his desire to want to do these large commitments overnight so suddenly, that is when it becomes more of a raised issue, as it is clear that not only are these plans ambitious, but they also come from a less stable headspace. One predisposing factor which I can identify with Toad relates to the loss of his parents, especially amplified due to the lack of emotional closure in relation to his father and the type of relationship they had. This links to the psychological and social model in relation to family relationships and trauma, as psychologically, the overbearing thoughts of grief as well as unresolved childhood issues can lead to very severe mental health problems, which can have a long-term effect on people such as Toad, who have been bottling up his emotions in regard to this for years. With regards to the psychological and social model playing a part on Toad's predisposing factors, it is known that in most cases relating to bipolar disorder, between 30% to 90% of clients diagnosed with BPD have a history of childhood abuse or neglect. In Toad's case, he struggled with a lot of emotional neglect as a child from both of his parents. We identify through his talks with his counsellor that Toad was never given any validation as a child from his father or any kind of indication that he's loved. Maslow's hierarchy of needs in relation to this model shows that esteem needs and belongingness and love needs are all vital for an individual, which we can identify Toad experienced a lack of as a child. In the book Counselling for Toads, Toad tells his counsellor how his father would always be displeased. He also then goes on to talk about how, since being a young Toad, he's tried to prevent his friends from ever being displeased with him, promising himself he'd do anything to make his friends like him again if he was to ever shame them. Adding to what I've already discussed in relation to Toad's childhood issues, it is a fair assumption to make that perhaps Toad's childlike state he carries with him today is caused by his lack of validation and ability to behave as a child from when he was younger. It is fair to assume that due to the lack of validation and esteem provided to him as a young Toad, that he may not have ever been granted the ability to behave how he truly should have as a child, which may also be a trigger regarding his obsessive side regarding to fast cars. Another predisposing factor regards Toad's current mental health issues that can be linked to his history of incarceration, caused by him stealing a car and then eventually escaping. It's not the action of stealing the car itself that brings Toad to feelings of shame, guilt, or regret, but more so the shame and embarrassment he believed his friends felt towards him. In Counselling for Toads, Mr Toad tells his counsellor what really hurt was the horrid way I was treated on my return. Moving on to precipitating factors, let's discuss some of Toad's responsibilities. He lives in a great Toad Hall, inherited by his father. He feels responsible for keeping things in order at Toad Hall, not only for his own sake, but for his father's and others who have an interest in visiting. This is a huge weight on Toad's shoulders, as he non-stop has this need to keep the Great Hall in excellent shape. Mr Toad is the only one living there, So the need for such a gigantic living space may also feel overbearing for Toad, and may take away that safety net that he has living there, which may be an overwhelming variable as to why he's let himself fall into this gloomy, unable state of mind he is in, which makes it hard for him to do arguably simple tasks. I believe a precipitating factor to his recent switch in emotions and stability may have something to do with the recent attack on his home, which I can imagine for Toad felt rather distressing. Having Toad's home being such an emotional attachment to him, being inherited down from his bereaved father, means that potentially he may have suffered more distress from the situation than perhaps others could first interpret. Toad is also the governor for the village hall where he lives. Being a governor with so much responsibility for so many people can be overbearing for anyone, especially for someone who's dealing with so many self-esteem issues such as himself. This relates to the psychological model. Toad tells his counsellor how Badger had agreed with the minister to take over Toad's role as the governor due to his belief that Toad was no longer fit for the role due to feeling depressed. When we look at the stress and vulnerability model put forward by Zubin and String in 1977, we can identify that with Toad being in a highly vulnerable place emotionally, that it wouldn't take much for him to become into an even more highly distressed state. In the vulnerability and stress model, it elaborates on how someone dealing with a lack of emotional stability can easily become more inclined to suffering further from smaller levels of stress, even if it spiraled from one comment made from his friend. In my opinion, with regards to perpetuating factors, one way in which his mental health issues are appearing to be maintained is to do with Toad's low self-esteem issues he appears to have. I believe that Toad's unhealthy fixation on the focus to never disappoint anyone around him, including his closest friends, is leading him to feelings of worthlessness. With regards to this need for him to feel validated by everyone around him, I believe his unresolved trauma with his father, who never showed him much love or emotional affection, may also be causing Toad's depressive outbreaks. I believe that in order for Toad to move forward and gain a sense of closure, he is to focus less on dwelling about what he could have said or done to live up to his father's standards, and instead to prioritise the healing and forgiveness process. This will also allow Toad to grieve in a healthy way and will encourage him to hopefully speak out more openly. I would also like to talk about Toad's perpetuating factors with regard to his obsessive fixation on motor cars and spontaneously splurging large amounts of money on various large vehicles and cars. For a person to have a hobby or to enjoy collecting such things is not where the issue lies. I believe that the issue with Toad's fixation on these cars relates to his instability to see when he should take a step back and analyse the situations at hand. In the film The Wind in the Willows, we can see Toad's eyes go all swirly, like he's in some kind of daze staring at this fast-moving cart while sat in the way of the middle of the road. This is presenting large risk factors to us, and this is when it gets more hazardous and dangerous. This relates to the psychological model, as I believe that Toad's desire to collect and purchase so many unnecessary vehicles comes from a place relating to coping skills and self-esteem issues. Toad cannot find satisfactory in himself and how his life is in the moment, so he's constantly finding new ways through his financial abilities in order to make changes and find a new thrill to seek out to. I also believe one perpetuating factor relates to Toad and Badger's friendship dynamic. Badger comes from a place of love and care, but his wiseness often portrays itself as more demanding and belittling. I believe a few communicative conversations between Toad and Badger would resolve all issues regarding their friendship. This relates to the social model with regards to peers and the psychological model in relation to attitude. One of the main protective factors in Toad's life is his friends, relating to informal support he has around him. They are the ones who discovered the suggestion of a counsellor and are also the ones that encourage Toad to take the scary leap and go and seek professional help. Another vital protective factor for Toad relates to formal support he's provided with through the use of his counsellor he visits weekly. Not only does his counsellor offer Toad the safe space to talk freely without the fear of judgment, but Toad's counsellor also offers him an insight as to why he may act certain ways at times. For example, when Toad's counsellor introduced him into the idea of behaving in a childlike state, Toad was then able to identify some of his unhelpful characteristics from a new perspective. Toad having a counsellor there to offer him someone to talk to, as well as formal support, relates to the social and psychological model. Another protective factor which I can identify for Toad relates to the family that he does have, such as his little nieces and nephews he talks about to his counsellor. He describes them as being cheery and playful, which may offer Toad the ability to explore his own childlike state, whilst bonding with his nieces and nephews. Another protective factor for Toad relates to his wealth. Toad is always a shout away from being cooked up delicious meals, which allows him to also gain a good nutritional and balanced diet. I believe Toad may be dealing with mental health issues with regards to the diagnostics of bipolar and mania. Toad may and continue to benefit from seeking support from his formal support of his counsellor. I've enabled myself the ability to identify subjects from a different light and to take a second look at everything I'm presented with, in regards to identifying how a personality trait may be formed. This will also help me to venture out and analyse new perspectives of a person who may be struggling with bereavement and self-esteem issues in particular.